Okay, so welcome to what is technically our second talk in this in our History at UON seminar series. And thanks again to Julie McIntyre for stepping up and serving as the guest chair for that talk a couple weeks back while I was still traveling. It's my pleasure to welcome everybody to our talk today. And I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that we are on the unceded traditional lands of the Pamalong clan of the Wagable Nation, at least those of us who are here on the Callahan campus. And I would like to acknowledge and pay my respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and extend this to this acknowledgement to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people amongst us, either physically or virtually. So it's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Professor Deborah Oxley, who is a retired professor of social science history at the University of Oxford and fellow of All Souls College. One stream of her research relates to criminal justice, and she is the author of numerous works on penal transportation, including Conflict Maids, The Forced Migration of Women to Australia, Cambridge University Press, 1996, and is a member of the ominously named Digital Panopticon team. And Deborah is here today to talk to us about English criminal law and practice from the 12th through 19th centuries. So without further ado, I will pass it off to Deb.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, I would also like to recognise the traditional custodians of Australia and that their lands remain unceded. And we're talking today about the reason in which those lands were stolen, which was to quench the never-ending thirst of British penal policy. So we are looking at English criminal law and practice with a big overview, hopefully, if I am quick enough. So 8 centuries, 45 minutes, I'll see what's possible. So an underlying question here is, why did England need penal transportation and how did it later cope without it? But we begin with the origins of modern justice as we know it. So we have Norman Conquest, we have the Plantagenets, we have nation builder and lawman, Henry II. And he gives us many of the concepts that underpin modern justice. So the concept of felony that we're going to be talking about as it is now used, habeas corpus, the idea that it's not the local lord of the manor that dispenses justice, but the justice resides with the king, that this is achieved through having circuit judges that travel around the country, and the idea of trial by jury of 12 good men and true. And he has a compatriot in this, Thomas Becket, but they fall out. And they fall out over the issue of how do you punish criminal priests? So when the clergy violate the criminal code, what do you do? Well, this is a big battle. This isn't a minor thing. This is really about the state versus the church. And Henry is trying to impose authority over the church. The church is reacting badly to this. And, Henry has a lot of problems with Becket. And, who will rid me of this troublesome priest? So it doesn't work out well for Becket. He ends up being murdered. On the other hand, it doesn't work out all that well for Henry either. So he ends up in the right pickle with the Pope over this issue. So benefit of clergy is something that gets established when he grovels to the Pope in 1170. And it's called the Compromise of Avranches. And it allows a member of the clergy who's committed a crime and is being prosecuted to say, please transfer me to an ecclesiastical court. You can imagine there are a few problems with that. Few exceptions, but not many. So you can plead at the beginning of the trial, send me to an ecclesiastical court. So the people eligible are clergy. But how do you spot who's clergy? Well, one thing you can do is you can look at their tonsure, you can look at the way they dress, but anyone can dress up and cut their hair with a corona. The other thing we know about them is they're literate. So what they do is introduce a literacy test. And over time, this becomes very well known. It's the 51st Psalm, the Nick verse, as it becomes known. O God, have mercy upon me, according to thine heartfelt mercifulness. This is a marvellous loophole introduced into criminal justice. So the court does have discretion about what it tests you in. It's usually the 51st Psalm. So guilty but literate laymen can claim to be clergy. The court gets to decide who it is that's literate. So this right to benefit of clergy extends over time. I'll just do it very quickly. Bit by bit, it extends to more crimes, to more people, so that by the 17th century, they even let women have it. So it takes a while. And this bit of legislation is interesting. So 1575, people are claiming clergy, say, send me to an ecclesiastical court. But of course, in practice, the ecclesiastical courts don't tend to punish. So they say, oh, well, you did wrong, but we'll let you go free. So it's not always popular letting criminals walk free, you may have noticed. So they come up with the idea that somebody who's had benefit of clergy will be branded so that you know that they've had it. And they even allow for the option of detaining them for 12 months, except they haven't really got anywhere to put them, so that doesn't work. So the system expands, so it covers eventually the whole population. It is described by William Blackstone, also of All Souls College, the wisdom of the English legislature in a course of a long and laborious process, extracted by a noble alchemy, rich medicine out of poisonous ingredients, and converted by gradual mutations, what was at first an unreasonable exemption of particular popish ecclesiastics into a merciful mitigation of the general law with respect to capital punishment. And later John Beattie described it as a massive fiction that tempered in practice the harshness of the common law rule that virtually all felonies are capital. So felonies, capital, ameliorated through benefit of clergy, a statute pardon, it's been termed. So we've seen it expand, but there's a parallel process going on. As I say, not everybody's happy about criminals walking free at the end of being found guilty. So they start contracting benefit of clergy. So a layperson who murders his master, petty treason, gets excluded in 1497. Under Henry in the 16th century, murder, felonies with malice prepense, sodomy, willful burning of dwelling houses, piracy, robbing, housebreaking, highway robbery, servants embezzling, stealing horses. These crimes are allegedly taken out of benefit of clergy. It's not until we get Elizabeth on the throne that things like rape, forcible marriage, sodomy again, robbery again, the same things again and again because it never quite works. But they're taking out a particular felony and saying you cannot claim benefit of clergy for it. So they're recreating the capital code. So these are crimes for which there is a death sentence. So the criminal law, where it stands, is you've got felony. So the felonies are, I think I've got it up there. These are the indicted crimes once they go to a court and a jury.
Okay. No, I didn't say.
Okay, so and then there's the other part of the criminal code are misdemeanors, and they're dealt with summarily. So felonies have now been divided into those which you cannot claim clergy for, so they genuinely are capital, and felonies where there's the option, the possibility of benefit of clergy. This largely maps onto courts. Higher courts can do anything, but a lower court can't do what a higher court can do. So felonies with mandatory death sentences go to the assize courts, others to quarter sessions, and these to petty sessions. So these have a mandatory death penalty. For this category, you've got anything that could be death if they decide to exclude you from benefit of clergy, or it could be that you get branded because you've claimed it, after which you walk free. Or you might, at some point, they try introducing whipping as the alternative, and they eventually are going to try and put people in workhouses because Elizabeth builds houses of correction. Misdemeanors, on the other hand, rely on shame and humiliation, corporal punishments. They do have some detention in these houses of correction after Elizabeth, and fines. And there are institutions, so death penalty, you're talking the gallows, unless you get royal mercy and you're pardoned. This, if you get death, it's the gallows, or the court is where you'll be branded. If you're branded, and there's a lot of discussion about whether this actually ever takes place. And as I say, with Elizabeth, you've now got houses of correction. Jails, people sometimes think that jails are places for long-term imprisonment. They're not. They are there to hold you while you're waiting justice. So you're waiting to be judged, or you've had a sentence and you're waiting for the sentence to be carried out. They're not large institutions holding lots of people. So if we push that over, because I'm running out of space. 1688, the Glorious Revolution. The bit where a propertied class becomes more powerful. You have a regular parliament, and it's going to represent the interests of the propertied at a time when the economic value of property is increasing. So what do? Quite a lot. They expand the legal code. So they keep on removing benefit of clergy from lots of different offences. For example, in 1698, again, burglary, housebreaking, robbery, horse stealing. These are the ones they want to remove benefit for. They also start inventing new punishments, and they come up with the idea of imprisonment. So at 1706, they abandon the reading test for benefit of clergy and just say everyone can have it. It's automatically available if you're a first offender. But they say we'll imprison you. Where will they put you? They'll put you into one of the Elizabethan houses of correction for between 6 and 24 months. Any longer is usually a death sentence in these institutions. So they don't do long term. But they have a problem. There really isn't the capacity. So it's not a very effective method, but they're trying. 1717, of course, they come up with the big one, and that's penal transportation. So now, if somebody commits burglary, housebreaking, or robbery, and they get royal mercy, they get pardoned, they don't walk free, they're going to be transported for 14 years. And you've now got the possibility of creating felonies that are clergyable and actually punishing them. So buying and receiving stolen goods, you'll get 14 years transportation. Feloniously stealing, taking from the person, grand larceny, you're going to get 7 years transportation. So we're replacing a system where you may have been branded, perhaps you'd have been whipped, perhaps nothing, you'd have just walked free from court. And we're going to impose real punishment. And they do something particularly queer in the 1717 Act. They take a misdemeanour, punishable with humiliation, etc., and they make it punishable with penal transportation. So that is an unusual thing to do. That, of course, has ramifications. Petty larceny is the lower form of larceny. If you steal less than sixpence, it's a petty larceny. Grand larceny is over sixpence. And this is a set of parliamentarians who are going to create more and more crimes. So that we have the Riot Act. The Waltham Black Act, Leon Radzinovitz actually calculated, it could be as many as 650 crimes created in this one single act. It's widely acknowledged to at least create 50 offences. So there is this process through which, I think because they've now got a greater supply of punishment, they're liberated to have a greater number of offences, and they go to town usually protecting power and property. So you end up with the bloody code, over 200 capital offences at a time when France has got 6. So just putting it in perspective. And it needs new institutions. If you're going to have imprisonment, where are you going to put them? And transportation, where are you going to send them? They don't really solve the where do you put them, so it doesn't work terribly well. Transportation works very well. They send them to America. They send them as indentured workers. So you sell them into what is already a coerced labour market with both slaves and indentured labour sections. So you've got ready demand in Maryland and Virginia. So it becomes self-funding. Because remember, the good thing about death is it's cheap. So if they want to find a replacement that's also cheap, and that works brilliantly for them at that point. But the trouble, the Americans get uppity, and the American War of Independence then creates a crisis for criminal justice. And the first thing that they have to do is create an act. What are they going to do with people who are being sentenced to penal transportation? Well, we know they create the hulks, and so they're held on the hulks overnight and they work at public labour during the day. But it's got other options. They say, petty larceny, no, you can't send them onto the hulks. But let's give you some more choice, judges. You can start imprisoning them. Now we've got enough pressure to stimulate a building boom in the houses of correction. So the 1880s in particular, you see a lot of growth. They want to build penitentiaries, but they haven't got anything like the money required or the political will to build a network of penitentiaries around the country. So houses of correction, welfare institutions are going to be used. So where does that leave us? It leaves us at the opening of the 19th century, where I have a lot of data, 2.3 million prosecution outcomes, all the people who were prosecuted in England and Wales from 1805 to 92. And I want to give you an idea of the type of crimes we're talking about. Is this relevant? These are the sort of records that from 1834 become standard. This is 1834. In that year, 22,451 offenders. They call them offenders, but over 6,000 of them are actually going to be acquitted, so they're not offenders. So if we zoom in on this at the bottom, come on, respond. Okay. We've got 6 categories: other offences. You've got perjury, administering unlawful oaths, conspiracy to raise the rate of wages, riot, breach of the peace. So other offences, 6%, so quite little. You've got forgery and currency crimes, so that's 2%. I don't know why it's so slow, but we'll have to put up with that. Category 4, malicious property crimes, 1%. These are small. But then we get to non-violent property crime. 74% of everyone going through the system is going through for non-violent property crime. So that can include, it's above. So it's cattle stealing, horse stealing, sheep stealing, larceny from the person by servant, simple larceny. So by this point, I think that's less than a shilling. It's gone up to a shilling from 6p. So that's the big category. Then you've got violent property crimes. So burglary, housebreaking, robbery, and the category that most people in society are most worried about, which are crimes of violence against the person. That's about 11%. So the bulk are about non-violent property crimes. Let me go back. So if we look at the non-violent property crimes, you can see now the type of punishments. Death, 6 people are sentenced to death. Servants, stealing letters, can't tolerate that. Otherwise, it's not getting death penalty, but you're getting quite a lot of people sentenced to life, 14 years, 7 years, transportation. But then you got even more having short-term imprisonment in these houses of corrections, and they are starting to build up jails now to hold people. Whippings, fines, very small numbers. So we had, I thought I had another figure there. So you've got 21% sentenced to transportation, 52% imprisoned, over a quarter acquitted. But also note, okay, it didn't come up again. But lots of the people who I showed you being executed, they're not executed. This is what we'll see now. People who really were executed. So on this axis, 1805 through to 1891, 92 actually. And on this axis, we've got the number of people. That axis will keep changing over the course of the rest of the tour. So these are the figures for people who are actually executed. And you can see it's increasing and then it's going to drop off. So what's influential? The 1823 repeal of the Black Act reinstates benefit of clergy from the Waltham Black Act took away from 50 crimes, they reinstate it. And the Judgment of Death Act allows judges discretion in applying a death penalty. And you can see that that has a huge impact, step change in the numbers. Peel's famous reforms of 27, we don't really see them doing much. He replaces death for everything with the option of transportation, but it doesn't really have a big effect. But what does is Lord Russell's reforms, where sheep stealing, cattle stealing, housebreaking, they say no more death for those. And you see how the numbers drop. And eventually, 37, they abolish the punishment of death in a lot of cases. So that by 61, you've only got 2 crimes punishable with death that remain on the books until the 1970s. Now that's been shrunk down to fit more people on. These are the people who were sentenced to death, who they don't execute. And you see what a very large body that is compared with the executions. So again, what's driving it? Well, the repeal of the Black Act and the Judgment of Death Act actually spur the use of the death penalty because they know that they can just sentence them to death, but then handpick the ones they want to transport instead. So it actually boosts the use of death. Real reforms, now we see possibly starting to have an effect, but it's not terribly clear. Sheep and cattle again, stop take that out and suddenly you start to see the numbers fall. And then that abolition absolutely puts it down so that you're now dealing with very small numbers. If you read the individual cases, which are recorded in the parliamentary papers, a lot of domestic violence is being represented there. The murders, often intimate partner violence. So who else do they punish? This is imprisonment. Sorry. This is the people they sentenced to transportation. So you remember death commuted. So they're the people that can now previously go to America, now going to Australia. So it's those crimes where they're getting 14-year and life sentences of transportation. But then so that's death commuted, and this is transportation proper. And you can see we're now getting up to over 5,000 in a year. So again, you can see repeal of the Black Act judgment of death as some fine. Appeals reforms spurs the use of direct sentences of transportation because death's being replaced by that option. Then we move towards thinking about it ending. It ends to New South Wales in 1840, but the numbers are still very high. Keeps going to Tasmania. 1853, they start indicating that it's going to end there as well. It ends there in 53. So how do you cope? Well, one story is the rise of the modern prison. This is the birth of the modern prison, a national prison system for the most serious offenders. So domestic detention for the first time, big scale domestic detention for serious criminals. Lots of problems, of course, if you keep them at home and once they're released. It's not as neat as sending them away and never seeing them again. And when they introduce them, in 42, they've closed New South Wales in 40. 42, they open the doors to Pentonville. So they immediately start building as soon as they know transportation is ending. They build Pentonville and they start building modern institutions. Here, they've had some time, they've not built anything like enough to cope with these numbers. So when they introduce this system, which is called penal servitude, they have a tariff. If you've been sentenced to 7 years, you're going to spend 3 years here. They have to bring in probation, which they borrow from the colonies, so that you might be on a sentence of 3 years, but maybe you'll get out in 1 or 2. So they have to keep the numbers down because they don't have the institutions to house them. And then they ramp it up a little bit. But on the whole, we're switching to shorter sentences. So we have this nice story that we replace death with transportation and transportation with the birth of the modern prison. But if we're going to believe that, we're going to have to believe that from the mid-1830s, time of enormous and growing hunger, political unrest, that we've got a decline that's consistent to the end of the century in serious crime. It looks a little bit hard to believe that there is this massive decline in serious crime. So I should check what the time is.
10:33.
Not too bad. So can we stick with this nice simple narrative, or is there something else going on? Well, let's look what else is going on. So we've now shrunk the transportation and penal servitude down, so the axis has gone up again. This is the growth of domestic imprisonment at the local level. So this is, I mentioned the houses of correction that Elizabeth, the poor law that she creates, requires these houses of correction for the detention of vagrants, etc., misdemeanors. And you see a really significant growth in the 1780s in the number of houses and the capacity. And they keep growing, and then the jails also start adding wings because there's this increasing shift, particularly after the American War. They have to start treating these people with the type of incarceration that previously might have just been for misdemeanors. And you can see how the numbers grow. Not shorter term, of course. I mean, they're keeping people in for months, in severe cases, up to 2 years. What else do they have? They have whipping. They can fine you. They can because this is all indictable crime that we're looking at here. Whippings, fines, discharge, sureties where they give you essentially a good behaviour bond. Now, if you can't find that bond, you're going to end up in prison, and that is going to become quite useful for them. Pardons, virtually nothing. Acquitted, there's always a large proportion who are acquitted. No bill not prosecuted, that really diminishes over time. So these are people where there's not enough evidence against you, or it's been a malicious application to prosecute. So that diminishes, the system becomes, if you like, very efficient at processing. The tiny, tiny number who are insane doesn't even show up. It's a tiny, tiny green line. So this is the shape of 1.5 million prosecutions across most of the 19th century. And again, it looks like, there really is some sort of amazing drop in the crime rate. These are just total figures, they're not adjusted for population or anything. Something's happening. So did crime decline like this? Or is something else happening, and is indeed a second process underway? So let us look at something else they came up with. There's the 1827 Larceny Act, the 1847 Juvenile Offenders Act, and the 1855 Criminal Justice Act. And one thing they all have in common is they're starting to shuffle out people who used to be down here, punished with these sorts of offences. They're starting to shovel them out into summary justice. So this is very small scale offences usually committed by children who previously we were sending across the world. 47 is the Juvenile Offenders Act. So if you're under 14 years of age, you can be dealt with, instead of going to court, instead of being judged by a jury and formal judges, you can just be dealt with by the petty sessions, the JPs. And if they think the crime's really bad, they'll send you up to an indictment. But they do this, and the quid pro quo is that JPs can only give short-term sentences. They can't give more than effectively 6 months. So it's got that going for it, but we're starting to weaken the principle of trial by jury. 1855 Criminal Justice Act, that applies the same logic to adults, but will incentivise you. So if you plead guilty, we'll send you to the summary courts, and they can only sentence you for, as an adult, maybe 6 months. I think it can't be more than 2 years. It may be up to 1 year. So if it's really small scale, if it's petty larceny, as it used to be called, we'll send you through that court pretty well automatically. But if it's a more serious offence, if you're willing to plead guilty, we'll push you through summary justice as well. Win-win, unless, of course, you're innocent. So what does that do to the numbers? Well, it takes over 10,000 people out, that one act, within the space of 2 years. And I can give you an estimate, because I finally found some data where the indictable, the Treasury is having to reimburse summary justice for the cases that the judges are now channeling through summary instead of through indictment. So in 1856, a year after, there's over 13,000 now being treated summarily, who should previously been treated on indictment. And I kept looking, and I now have data for the last quarter of the century. And I will keep looking and try and find more. But what looked like a decline isn't looking like a decline anymore. So if we shrink this down so that we can see the top of that, look at the scale we're at now. We're talking about 60,000 at that level. So it's looking not like a nice story of the decline of serious crime, but it's actually a story that looks a whole lot like continuous, rapid expansion. So something of that ilk. Starts, there's a little bit happening all along here, but it really takes off with these, particularly this act. So you've got this massive shift. Then, just when I thought they'd come up with everything they could think of, the 1879 Summary Justice Act is appreciating that these people, lots of them are now being sentenced to imprisonment. Prisons are overcrowded. What a surprise. What can we do? How about we tell the justices that if they think it's a good idea, and I know we've got lots of laws that say you can't do it, but you can just fine them. Then it doesn't cost us anything to house them, and we get the fines. We can start diverting that to things like compensating victims or paying for public prosecution, or all those institutions of justice that aren't there at the beginning of the century, like the modern police, the prison system, the probation system, public prosecution, which is probably one reason you start to see so many more prosecutions occurring. So by 1892, class 3, that's 74% that we saw back in 1834, the bulk of these indictable offenders, nearly 90% are being dealt with through summary justice. And let's have a look what that means in terms of punishments. This is starting to look a little more cost effective. And this is the problem from the beginning to the end. When they lose transportation, they are constantly battling to finance this system. Transportation to New South Wales is expensive. This is even more expensive. So you've now got a third of these people being sentenced to imprisonment, but short term, nearly 10% for 14 days or less, 12% for above 14 days, but less than a month. You've got people being whipped, you've got sureties, you've now got a fifth of them being fined. And the number discharged continues fairly similar. And the numbers we're now talking about, 51,000 people in this 1 year. So you've got 18,500 being sent to, albeit very short-term sentences, but being sent to institutions. You've got 11,000 of them just being fined. Now, these are the remaining 11% who are going through the court system. So they're still there. These are, one thinks, the most serious of these offences. Again, penal servitude hardly exists. Not for this sort of crime anymore. What they're doing is what they're doing over there. They're sending them to prison, but for shorter terms. So if they do send them to penal servitude, it's 3 to 5 years, not 7 to life. And imprisonment, it's between about a month and a year. So we go from what we started with, where we saw 21% transported, 52% in prison. Nobody, well, not nobody, but below a percent fined or whipped, no sureties. By 1892, there's nobody, below a percent being sent to penal servitude, mainly being imprisoned, a fifth of them being fined, and they're also getting very much into whipping. They particularly like whipping children, boys especially, and 6% are sureties. Now, they're using prison, but they're using it in a wholly different way. I mean, really short sentences. They're going back to the Elizabethan practices. So this is an antidote to the crowded prisons that they saw immediately following the end of penal transportation, because they didn't have a prison system. So this is their response to ending penal transportation, trying to limit how bad the prisons were getting. So it's cost-effective justice. And the process that we've just traced confirms that. By getting rid of the death penalty for so many crimes, it meant you didn't need to use assize courts, because that was now something Court of Sessions could handle. When we decided to go for less indictable crime, we moved larcenies into petty sessions and the JPs. So again, you're moving them down into the lower courts, and that has financial benefits. This is 1857. This is the cost of running an assize case. The average per case, £17. You're prosecuting people who've maybe stolen 5 shillings, and it's costing you £17. To be fair, you're more likely to have stolen something more valuable than that to end up at the assize, but you would have previously been spending £10 on larcenists who hadn't actually stolen much by our standards. And I mean, in today's money, we're talking $50 as the cut-off. Anything over 50 would be grand larceny in an old terminology. But then if you can get them out of that altogether, you're only paying £1 case. So yes, this is cost-effective justice. But is it justice? This is not the principle of having a trial of 12 good men and true judging you. This is justice on the cheap. It sets up incentives for people to admit to crimes that they didn't commit, because it's going to be hard for them to prove innocence, even though that's not meant to be how the system works. So it was something that previous prime ministers had said no. When their Department of Justice had come to them and said, we can do it on the cheap, we can do this. This select committee has proposed these ideas. They said, no, it is against the principles of justice that every freeborn Englishman, etc. So that's pretty well the big picture that I wanted to discuss with you. Because what we've seen is, in closing the benefit of clergy loophole, is a system develops at a time when they're getting really keen on punishing property crime that has, by our standards, exceptionally severe punishments, and by their standards, exceptionally severe. You'd have walked free with benefit of clergy. You might, if you're unlucky, have got branded, and there was 3 years when, instead of branding you on the brawn of the thumb, they did it here. N for murder, T for thief. And they, of course, found that those people did not get reintegrated into society. So even they could see how damaging that was, and they quickly abandoned that and went back to the brawn of the thumb. But the literature is always complaining that they use a cold iron. They don't really brand you. Sure, some did. There's little levels of discretion throughout this system. But they build this huge edifice, and we live with it today. All of the countries that have Blackstone's books, who've borrowed English law and applied it in their own way, we're all living by this evolution. So we saw 74% property crimes dominating the serious level of felonies. When do you think the UK stopped property crime being the major reason you got put in prison? When was it less than 50% of the people who were in prison? 1993.
So the 1980s, so that's really.
Yeah, 1993, they finally get it to just under 50%. So all those institutions they're not full of serious drug thieves and murderers and rapists. They're still full of thieves. Now, I'm not an advocate for theft, but other societies find other ways of punishing. And when you think about the scale of investment, first in transportation, but then in building the national penitentiary system, building all the local workhouses, employing police forces in every county, in having a branch of detectives, in having lawyers employed by the police who are going to prosecute for those who can't afford to prosecute for themselves, where you need to have a probation system because everywhere's so crowded we have to keep shifting them out. Imagine if they'd spent just a fraction of that on social policy. I mean, the scale of what they're spending is enormous, and that one day is my ambition, is to actually count up how much investment. It's the next big one after them doing the army, the navy and the royal list. The next big expense is punishment. And yeah, meanwhile, it's not until the 1870s that we get any sort of public education. 1880s becomes compulsory. And then they can start locking those kids up if they don't turn up. So it's a very punitive country, and too many places have been infected by it. And I'm sure, I don't know what the time is, but thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that fascinating overview and really illuminating trek through the legal system. We do have about 5 minutes or so for questions. And it looks like Kit and then Effie.
Hi, Deborah. Thank you for that wonderful history of criminal justice in the UK. I'll get to the point. I do the 1790s in the Caribbean. It's the Revolutionary Wars. And I've got a population on Grenada and St. Vincent who were ethnically cleansed in 1796 and sent to Roatan Island, a deserted desert with no water on the coast of Nicaragua. And half of them died, of course, within weeks. But I can't find any information about this kind of transportation. I know it did occur, and of course they went on to form the Garifuna population, and it's now about 700,000 people. And they were taken in by the Spanish, who felt sorry for them because they were all dying on this little island. So I'm wondering about sources for this sort of period and transportation in the 1790s. And I also noticed that the figures in the 1820s were very high. And I was wondering if that was because of, you know, post-revolutionary unrest in the UK, Peterloo kind of thing. So yeah, I was wondering if you could perhaps shed a bit of light on that.
Well, on the second easier question, crime jumps when soldiers come back after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and there is dislocation, and there is political protest, and there is Luddism, and we see those people we see them at the Australian end arriving, sent out for riot. The bulk of it is still driven by the usual thing, which is larceny of some description. Slightly less for robbery. But there are connections there, yes. As for sources, do you have ideas on that? Normally, I mean, in Australia, they had the problem that even though they had a judiciary set up early on, they don't have the right to retransport. This is the current debate, I believe, with some historians. So for them to have done it legitimately would have required British parliamentary action. So I would check parliamentary papers and criminal justice records.
Mhm.
But when they're far away, they do all sorts of things they're not meant to do. Or
Yeah.
else I will think about that. If I can think of records, I mean, who had to pay for the removal? Do they charge that to the British? Because if so, it'll appear in the Treasury documents.
Yes, I think the Navy supplied the ships
Okay, the Admiralty
on this
records.
island with a little bit of stores and food,
Yeah.
and then just sort of ignored them. I think the plan was to turn Roatan into a kind of spy base to watch the Spanish in Nicaragua and use this population to kind of form a basis for the occupation. But of course, it was a complete disaster. And in the end, after a few years, the Spanish just went and rescued them and brought them to Guatemala and Nicaragua. So, and then they became this famous population. But it's just the Roatan Island. It was just a really obscure place of transportation in the middle of this war. And the information is very thin because there's no records for Honduras because they were all destroyed. So,
Do you know the work by Claire Anderson?
yes.
Because if anyone's found those records, Claire is somebody who I would have expected to come across them.
Great. Okay, I'll send Claire a note. Thank you.
She's at Leicester.
So we might move on to Effie now, and then I think that'll be the last question.
Deb, that was great. Fascinating, actually. Many questions about the logic of the carceral state, particularly relevant here in Australia, but I won't get into that. As you were speaking, I kept on thinking about social policy, and then I kept on thinking about the institutionalization in the 60s and 70s of mental hospitals, not to equate criminality with mental illness, although it was back then. But this process of thinking, okay, well, it's going to save us money if we take these people out and put them in the community. We can, we've got the medication for it, but the services weren't there. And then when I was thinking of that change where people were fined, for example, instead of imprisoned, and I kept thinking actually throughout your entire presentation, wasn't there anyone who was saying, hang on, what if we help these people? What if we make sure that they don't steal? And I know that's a naive question, but
No, there are lots of people at any time. You've got dissent, you've got disagreement over how to deal with these issues. I mean, in the aftermath of the American War, David's just been working on this a bit. You've got William Eden, who is, the senior figure in government. He wants to build a penitentiary system across the country, but he gets rolled because most of the other people, ratepayers, etc., don't. And the democratic outcomes, when you've got a group with particular vested interests, tend to lead to the cheapest possible solution. And they do get addicted to serious punishment of not the crimes that we ordinary folk tend to think of as the ones we really want to manage. So there are people, yes, and there are lots of reformers. But then again, that some of the reformers get it horribly wrong. They respond to penal transportation and death by saying, well, let's have the penitentiary. Blackstone's term. But I mean, the idea becomes, through John Howard and others, that we will create good institutions and we will break people and remake them. We will make them penitent. And the systems that they evolved, separate and silent system, it's mind-blowing how harsh that what was a really good impulse of wanting to help people reform led to us creating the modern houses of correction that they build, like Wandsworth, built in 1850, thereabouts, maybe 1860 even. So this is the concept of the all-seeing centre. And you have corridors that run off it, these wings. And you lock people in their cells for 23 hours a day. and they come out to exercise.
Sorry, I hate to
Oh,
cut you
sorry,
off,
we're
but
over.
It is 10 o'clock now, or 11.
11 even.
We can continue certainly over coffee afterwards, but I'd like to thank everybody for attending and thank one more time Deb for her wonderful talk. Our next talk is on the 21st of March, 2 weeks from now, where we'll be welcoming Joe Dowling-Soka. Thank you again and have a great rest of your weekend.